Hey everybody, it's Wes from Printful. I'm joined today by Eric and Hannah.
Hi.
Hello.
They're on our design services team, and they're going to go over some 2019 design trends for us.
So the first trend we're talking about has a lot to do with patterning, specifically 80s and 90s influence patterning. This taps a lot into like nostalgia. It has a lot to do with like kind of big contrasts and intricate shapes, pastel colors, and kind of like a lot of whimsical subject matter, that kind of thing.
I guess for the both of us, if you had grown up in like the 80s and the 90s, then you would remember those old TV shows where they would have those really fun sort of title cards and they had little animations going in and out. And so this particular design really reminds us of things like that, where it has like a lot of pattern, a lot of solid colors, and really interesting shapes.
It's a lot about kind of having this bombastic feeling, like it's not subtle, it's not minimal. It's very kind of like in your face, but while still being fun.
It looks like it's fun and it looks like it's really energetic. It almost looks like all the little bars of ice cream are just kind of floating from the air, but there's also kind of a very solid colored background to help contrast that sort of 3D element of the ice cream. And then you see those little dotted lines, kind of like ants, kind of moving from the puddle to puddle and like just making a trail of melted ice cream as they go. So yeah, it's really fun.
Do you have any like tips or advice on creating patterns?
Well, it's good to start with like a single tile and then work your way out. Even if you're going to do something that's supposed to look more scattered and random, you should always be considering how one edge goes into the other and how things mirror across that single tile, and then how from there you can extrapolate it out.
It would vary on the pattern itself, so the tile can be very small, and then you can design all your elements in there. And if the tile is small, then you have a design that seems a little bit more filled. Yeah, so a pattern like this particular design trend, you can see on a lot of all-over products that we offer. And this particular one is our all-over tote bag. But we do certainly recommend that when it comes to creating all-over pattern designs, that you kind of start with the largest possible dimensions, and that would actually be for our leggings product. And so you can start by making your pattern as large as possible, and then you can use that very same pattern for all the other products that we offer, whether that is an all-over shirt, an all-over tote bag like this.
So for our second trend, we have stylized 3D illustrative text. A big one for this is using the isometric perspective. It's an easy way, engaging way to give your font volume and depth, and also gives you more options in terms of the composition and how that fits across the shirt or whatever the garment is.
We would still put it within the category of like illustrative text, even though when you look at it, it has a more geometric feel. I think it's because of like the way that it's placed. The colors that you see here are a little bit like there's aspects of neon, so that kind of goes back to the similar nostalgic 80s, 90s sort of retro designs that we were talking about before.
Right.
And you'll also see that in elements like the shadow. You see the sort of like dotty.
Zipatone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that pattern over there. And then even the colors itself, it almost looks like the color was placed and then sort of shifted a little bit,
right.
You know? So it's really cool, and it gives it a sense of motion even though it's a static image.
So something like this, it can translate to a few different types of products really well, but it definitely looks good on a mug. It can fit really well without necessarily like a background or other types of elements. So it works really well for this kind of thing.
And it works perfectly for those of you who like tea or coffee or just whatever you want more of.
Right.
This mug.
Cool, yeah, but this is kind of a classic setup that you can do on like lots of the product. Like this also could easily go like on a t-shirt or across the chest or wherever you're wanting to put it.
Right. The only thing we'd recommend is that you certainly make sure that all the colors are within gamut, so they don't print out in a way that is completely unpredictable for you. Our third design trend is all within the realm of typography, and this is also illustrative type. This in particular, when you do look at it, you'll think, oh, this is illustrative type because it is a hand-lettered sort of font. It's done in an illustrative way, but it's just a different sort of style in comparison to the isometric text design.
If you're looking to sort of elevate your font design, you want to think about what makes sense to your brand, right?
Right.
Do you want to go with something 3D and blocky and retro, or are you looking for something more rustic, more intimate, more handmade? And for something like this, it definitely is worth putting the extra time to either yourself design it or find a designer who works well with hand-drawn font and lettering, because it really kind of sets you apart from any kind of like basic font you can just find and download online, right? It's going to give your design a lot more character. It's going to make it stand out a lot more.
If you take a look at the details of the text in itself, you'll notice that the font was I guess, hand lettered to look like it's actually made out of sugar, which is just really great. I mean, you can see the little sugar granules on the bottom, but we would recommend that something for this, you keep a solid color background behind it, especially if this was created in something like Photoshop where it's done much more painterly. All those different elements where the granules of sugar are within the text would be semi-transparent.
Right.
And so it would just be wise to not have it be on a transparent background and have those just cause your orders to be placed on hold.
So with that in mind, it would translate really well to something like our sublimated pillow, where you can use any kind of background color you want, including things that are more popular right now, like this kind of color. And also it's kind of fitting for this product because it is a much more intimate kind of thing. For our fourth design trend, it's something that's referred to as cut-up design or collage design. And basically it's where you're taking generally something that's like photographic and then something that's illustrative or graphic, and juxtaposing two different things together.
And sometimes we're not even limited to just using photographic elements and illustrations. Like there's so many different variations of ways you can do this. It can be photos with photos. It can be illustrations with illustrations, just as long as there's a clear contrast, so it doesn't just look like one photo and it doesn't look like just one illustration. It really looks like you were taking the concept of the contrast and the juxtaposition of the two elements and really collaging it together in a visually appealing way.
Talk me through when you created this, like why you chose what you did and how it works, you know, based off of kind of what you just mentioned.
I knew the kind of imagery I wanted, so then it was a matter of like, hey, how do I fit that together? You know, what's like kind of like the emotion you want to evoke here with the design? And from there, it's like finding different reference images, different photos to use, right? And it's like you can take those yourself, or you can find like free-to-use stock image sites. So you can download images at high resolution, because those are the ones you want to work with. And so when I found one that I liked, I was like, okay, how can I cut this open? How can I tear it apart? How can I make it so I can fit my own thing into there, right? And then manipulate everything else from that starting point. So with this kind of design, it fits really well with our DTG printing because you're using photographic elements. And so that means a lot of different types of texture and really subtle like shifts in tone and color.
Yeah, that's something you couldn't really do with like screen printing,
Right.
Or if you did, it would be crazy expensive.
Exactly, and you could never be able to get the kind of like really subtle shifts like this.
And even with something like this where you can see the contrast between the illustration and the photograph, I like the way that there's just a sense of harmony all throughout the image. And I think that that's something that the designers that you're working with should really keep in mind, where at least something like this, when you see the color, you see how the color sort of wraps around the entire image. It leads your eye. It makes you aware that all of this is part of the same image, and it doesn't make your eye just dart around in different places that it shouldn't be. Our fifth design trend has to do with exaggerated characters. So this is within the realm of like graphic design and illustration, but it specifically is character driven. With these exaggerated kind of stylized characters, you see larger arms, larger legs, and a sort of smaller stylized features of the face and head. In this particular design, it's sort of a fun Egyptian hieroglyphic kind of design, but with a sort of modern twist. You see the god of death, Anubis, with the god of knowledge, Thoth. And they're giving each other a sort of high five, while you have little sort of graphics of flowers and patterns and I guess the little idols of, with the wings just kind of all making a sort of pattern with them themselves.
And this is even kind of something I've noticed, like at Printful here ourselves, we've started using kind of these characters a lot, just in our recent like publications and stuff that we've done.
Right, absolutely. It's certainly a style that you see prevalent in a lot of sort of infographic, kind of motion graphic kind of animations that you see, because then it really guides the eye of the viewer to see what it is that these characters are doing, not so much needing to see their emotional response. They're just kind of pointing and then you look to where they point. So creating a design like this where it's almost like a pattern but in a very limited composition is something that is really convenient, especially if you make sure to keep the background a solid color and also separate from the rest of the elements in the foreground. And that really helps for products like this phone case, where all you really have to do is remove the background and then kind of rearrange some of the elements so that they fit the template. And at least for this particular one, because the template in itself is a little bit longer than it is wide, that allows for these additional elements that you can put on the top and bottom, so it looks like you've basically created this design specifically for the product.
And that speaks to the larger concept that you should always be thinking about what the final destination is for these graphics, for your designs. Because something that makes sense on a tote might not make sense for a phone case or a sweater. You want to try to avoid getting into that method where you're trying to make one graphic that will just you can just plaster across every single different item, right?
Right.
You want to kind of have a more considered approach.
There's no way that your products will look 100% exactly the same across the board for every single product, especially when you're printing on just a variety of different fabrics and textures. Yeah. So that would be the case for something like this tote bag, which is very thick, it's very textured, and it's a completely different color as well. Like it's a sort of, what is it, like a cream, canvas. Yeah, sort of like a cream sort of color. And so for something like this, it seems like it would be much more convenient to just remove all that color, leave it with just line work so you don't have any of the ink sort of smudging into some of the elements of the line work.
And so what changes did you make in order to put it on the sweatshirt here?
For this one, it was just line work only, and I made sure that the layers of all the colors were on separate layers. So the background is on a separate layer, the colors themselves are on a separate layer. That would also depend on whether you want to keep individual colors on separate layers, so you could just change all of those colors in just one sort of fell swoop if you want to.
Okay.
And making sure that all the line work is on a separate layer as well. So it would apply for something like this. And if you want to create a sweater with just like singular line work, but you already have color in it, all you have to do is just turn off the layers. Cool. And so that was the case with this, and just sort of rearranging some of the elements. And that's certainly a tip that would be really helpful for any of you that are actually designing or is actually planning on going through our design services team for any products. When it comes to submitting a design request, it is absolutely clear to know what products you will be creating at the end. So we also know to what extent we should be, separating all layers, separating certain elements, so we know how the design will look on these different products. Because as you can see, there's certainly visual variations.
So for our last design trend, we're going to talk about embroidered emblems and logos. Now that the technology is getting to where it's much easier to implement that kind of thing on different types of garments, not just hats, it's becoming really popular, especially in tandem with enamel pins and patches and stuff like that. It's a way to kind of elevate your garment, elevate the product, give it a new space for something to make your logo more recognizable and more prevalent, aside from just printing it, as an inside label or an outside label or some other part of your graphic. There is something nice about having it embroidered on a sweater, where it's more substantial. There's kind of more weight to it, right? Than as opposed to just a DTG print. You want to make sure you're designing a graphic with, if it's going to be for embroidery, from the start, design it for embroidery. It's much easier to create a new design that's meant for that, as opposed to take something you already have and it's oh, well, maybe I'll just make it embroidered. Because you're inevitably going to run into issues there in terms of translating it from something that works great for print that can also work for embroidery.
Just to make it clear, all of the designs in the previously mentioned trends will not work for embroidery. So in no way can you repurpose any of the designs.
So when designing something for embroidery, what kind of works best for that? What do we need to keep in mind when creating something for embroidery?
So you want to basically adopt the concept that you're thinking of things in terms of shapes instead of drawings or any kind of outline like that. Because everything has a certain thickness requirement. Letters have a certain thickness and height requirement. So you want to think of everything in terms of thickness and spacing more than a drawing of a logo.
That even applies to an outline. If you were to outline elements in your design, we recommend that you do think of it as if it's a shape. The outline in itself is something that's measured in terms of the thickness and its spacing from other elements of the design. So we do see that as a shape.
So a design like this kind of touches on everything we've talked about leading up until this point, It's fun, it has primary colors and design elements, but it's also very clear and easy to read, right? It immediately takes the design, makes it iconic. I put it in the left chest, and it plays all the strengths of our embroidery. Everything here, the thickness has been considered, the spacing has been considered, and it all has been well thought out.
And you can certainly see the difference between something that was created specifically for embroidery as opposed to a realistically created and painted tiger made for print that a client or I guess a designer would want to have translated into embroidery.
And this really helps make your product premium at this point. You can get printed shirts all across the place, but it's very hard to find like really good embroidered shirts. So that's just a really cool way for like you and your customer to like stand out from like the crowd with their like what they're wearing as a statement.
Yeah, it's certainly a really good idea. I mean, you could either just have it be a singular embroidered graphic and then just have that alone. You can I guess designate a hoodie or a sweater or a jacket to be the one that you're going to fill with patches and pins and stuff, and you just want to start somewhere.
And let's see, you have it on a hat as well.
Yeah. This particular design was created so that it could be translated for both embroidered hats and for sweaters. But you do have to keep in mind that the template when it comes to embroidered shirts and sweaters is much larger, 4x4, as opposed to a high-profile hat like this, where it would actually be a better idea if you were to offer both embroidered hats and shirts to actually create the design specifically for hats first. And then you can sort of increase the size when it comes to making it appropriate for embroidered shirts.
The last thing I want to talk about isn't necessarily a design trend, but kind of like a fashion trend. And that's every year, like Pantone, they pick out what the color is for the different seasons and for the year. And so for 2019, that color is living coral. And so that's something that everyone can kind of incorporate into their designs or into like the actual color of the product that they're working with, because you'll start to notice that in stores everywhere. You'll start to see that color start popping up. So it's a great way to stay with the trend of the bigger society that you're selling in by doing that. And just, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, I'm only selling coral shirts. I'm like, y'all have created these designs with elements of that in there, correct?
Right. And it's a good starting off point, you know, to think about like what colors are popular, but it should always come second to like what your brand is about and what your main aesthetic is, and it should always be in service to that, the kind of design choices you make, right?
Sure.
It's whereas like one of the big reasons like these kinds of colors like coral and other types of pastel colors are pretty prevalent right now is because it goes in tandem with like the 80s and 90s vintage kind of designs. Right. And aesthetic that's also popular. It's a smaller part of a bigger theme.
Right.
And it's like if your brand fits in with that, then you know it will fit in with that to varying degrees.
Right.
And you always kind of like want to maintain that you're focusing on like the core concept of what your brand is.
And you can play around with it too. It doesn't necessarily have to just be coral. It can be things in that same like gamut and spectrum of the color. So just different shades of pink and peach, and each company and brand has like different like terms they like to use that are cute for their colors. So you can play around on the site to check those out. Eric and Hannah, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really great information here. We'll leave a link to the design services in the description below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that way you will always get great content like this.